Susan Kyraskowicz, fondly referred to as Sue, was born on February 13, 1965, to her parents, Ron and Marlene Kyraskowicz. She spent her childhood in Saugus, Massachusetts, alongside her brother, Ronald, and her sister, Deborah. During her high school years, Sue showcased her creativity and authenticity, enjoying roller skating, running track, and creating art. Her remarkable talents and intelligence led her teachers to describe her as exceptionally gifted. With a kind and generous spirit, Sue was always eager to help others and was known for her warm smile. Friends and family characterized her as feisty yet compassionate. As a quiet and kind student, she had a particular fondness for Snoopy, the beloved character from Charles Schulz's iconic comic strip, Peanuts. At one point, Sue even pursued her passion for cartooning, traveling to San Francisco to meet Charles Schulz in person. After graduating from Saugus High School in 1983, she continued her education at Salem State College, North Shore Community College, and later the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. Sue's life was marked by her creativity, kindness, and a determination to follow her dreams. Sue ultimately landed a job with an airlines company in 1989. Sue made history by becoming the second woman to join Northwest Airlines as a ground services employee on the ramp at Logan Airport in Boston. Working in a male-dominated airline industry, Sue faced numerous challenges as she was often subjected to harsh treatment by her coworkers. But she was fearless when it came to displaying her capabilities and standing her ground. Her responsibilities included loading and unloading baggage and de-icing planes. Despite the occasional hectic nature of her job, Susan rarely had any complaints. During Sue's time at Northwest Airlines, she went from cleaning jet interiors to achieving yet another milestone in her career in 1992. Sue's determination and loyalty towards her work didn't go unnoticed, and she was handed the role of baggage supervisor, which made her the first woman ever to hold the position for Northwest Airlines at Logan Airport. Discover the chilling world of secret crime mysteries, where we delve into the most perplexing cold cases and unsolved crimes. Join us as we unravel hidden clues and explore haunting mysteries. Subscribe now and be part of the journey to bring these cases to light. With the barrier she broke within the airline industry, Sue's professional journey paved the way for many young women to follow their dreams. Although Sue liked working at the airport, she often found herself dreaming about becoming a firefighter someday. And soon Sue's career path took an unexpected turn when she took the firefighter placement exam and excelled at it. She secured the 8th position on the reserve list for the Swampscott Fire Department and was hoping to join the force soon. Sue was clearly not afraid by the idea of entering other male-dominated industries. She was a career-driven woman, and she was not going to let anything stop her. Sadly, before Sue could hear back from the Swampscott Fire Department, something awful happened. Although Sue lived with her parents, her hectic work schedule often kept her busy at the airport. A lot of times Sue would work overnight and weekend shifts, which frequently took her away from her home, making her miss out on the time she would get to spend with her family. Marlene, Sue's mother, recalled that there were days when she and Sue would hardly get to see each other. Their interactions had been limited to brief passing moments. Marlene would only know that Sue was home when she noticed her work uniform left in a heap of laundry just outside her bedroom door. It was Saturday on September 12, 1992, and Sue had been scheduled to work another night shift which began at 11 p.m. and would end by 7 a.m. the next day. It was one of the busiest shifts, and Sue knew that it was going to be a long night. Although having worked for Northwest Airlines for more than 3 years, Sue had learned her way around these kind of shifts. She knew which hours would be less packed and which ones would not even let her breathe. While working her shift around 1 a.m. on September 13, 1992, Sue offered to fetch some sandwiches for her crew members. She drove her sky blue Toyota Tercel off the airport grounds and headed towards her go-to restaurant in Revere. Hours went by, but Sue never returned. Back at home that same morning, when Marlene didn't see Sue's uniform in the laundry heap, she didn't pay much attention to it. Since Sue worked overtime in the past, Marlene thought that Sue probably got caught up with and would return later. The next day, on Monday, September 14, 1992, Marlene noticed that Sue still wasn't home and the laundry pile was empty. It was unlike Sue to not come home for 2 days in a row without informing her family. That was when Marlene grew concerned and called the airport to check if Sue was okay. To her surprise, Marlene found out that Sue had never shown up for work on Monday, September 14, 1992. As fear crept in, Marlene reached out to the authorities and reported Sue missing. That same morning, on Monday, September 14, 1992, a manager for Bravo Auto and Tire Service Company, which was located almost 4 miles from Logan Airport in the town of Revere, was heading to work around 7:30 a.m. Driving through Lee Burbank Highway, commonly known as Route 1A. He noticed a car parked in the service's center parking lot. He couldn't recall anyone from his workplace having that car. When he walked up to the vehicle to have a closer look, he found blood dripping from the trunk of the car. He rang up the authorities to look into the matter, and shortly after, officers from Massachusetts Police Department arrived at the scene. The detectives instantly recognized the car. It was the same sky blue Toyota Tercel Marlene had described to them when she reported Sue missing. Slightly aware of what was coming next, the detectives opened the trunk and their eyes were met with a gruesome sight. 27-year-old Susan Cheraskiewicz's blood-covered body had been crumpled up and stuffed inside to fit into the small area. Sue had bruises and stab wounds on her body, which implied that she had been beaten up before being stabbed to death. The detectives broke the tragic news to Sue's family. Ron, Sue's father, pulled himself together and held Marlene in his arms as she burst out crying. When the detectives searched the car, they found that the money Sue was going to use to buy the sandwiches was still with her. This implied that she never made it to the restaurant that night. Even though Sue had neither been robbed or assaulted, her family initially assumed that the attack on Sue was not planned. The detectives too at first thought that Sue's murder was a random act of violence and believed that she was killed somewhere else before being driven to the auto shop. But as the investigation progressed further, detectives found themselves uncovering a much deeper conspiracy, which led them back to Logan Airport, Sue's workplace. When questioning Sue's co-workers, detectives found out that Sue had received a phone call from someone right before she left to pick up sandwiches for her co-workers on the night before her disappearance. Finding out who this caller was became the utmost priority for the detectives. Even after spending hours conducting interviews with Sue's crewmates at Logan Airport, detectives couldn't identify who this person was. Nobody at Sue's workplace seemed to have a clue or cared enough to even ask Sue about this mysterious caller. Questioning Sue's family, neighbors, and friends wasn't of much help either. Marlene, Sue's mother, believed that Sue might have gone to meet the person who was on the other end of the phone that night, but she would never have gone alone. According to Marlene, Sue was a careful woman who was aware of the dangers that lurked in Saugus. She would never go out alone during those hours of the night. Furthermore, Sue's co-workers told the detectives that when Sue didn't come back to the airport, the thought that something bad had happened to her never struck their minds. And instead of reporting Sue missing, they marked her time card till the day her body was found. According to Sue's attendance log, she had returned from the sandwich run, left for home at the end of her shift, and returned to work the next day. When the police asked the reason behind this, they said that they were covering for her. However, Marlene was very suspicious about this. The very first question she asked Sue's coworkers was if Sue had ever done this before, if Sue ever left work and did not come back. There was a sense of regret on the faces of Sue's coworkers as they replied with a no. Marlene still couldn't understand why no one at work reported Sue missing. Extreme thoughts were taking over her mind as she sensed some sort of foul play from the coworkers. She wondered if there was a cover-up of some sort involved and asked the detectives to look closely into it. On Saturday, September 19, 1992, a funeral service for Sue was held at the Bisbee Purcell Funeral Home, 549 Lincoln Avenue in Saugus. Dozens of her loved ones gathered and mourned the loss as Sue was laid to rest. The investigation surrounding Sue's case took a serious twist when two of her co-workers, Joseph Nuzzo and Robert Bobby Brooks, were identified as potential suspects in Sue's murder. Amidst a complex web of relationships between the three of them, it was revealed that Sue and Brooks briefly shared a romantic relationship that didn't end well. Since then, Sue tried to avoid any contact with Nuzzo and Brooks because she would almost always end up getting in trouble. One time Brooks even broke Sue's radio for no reason at all. When Sue's then boyfriend confronted Brooks about the same, he verbally threatened him and Sue. In another incident which took place sometime in April 1989, Sue attempted to intervene in a physical altercation involving Nuzzo and two other colleagues. Nuzzo's response to this was far from appropriate. He resorted to throwing derogatory slurs aimed at Sue. The severity of his behavior led Northwest Airlines to temporarily terminate his employment, which was a much-needed action. Even during his time off, Nuzzo didn't let go of the strong grudges he held against Sue. In roughly 6 months, Brooks made an unsettling return to Northwest Airlines, gaining his employment back, all while nursing hate towards Sue for his prior dismissal. All the hatred and resentment Nuzzo harbored was unleashed as a wave of harassment directed at Sue. He vandalized her car, punctured her tires, stalked her residence, made anonymous threatening phone calls, and confided in others, including Brooks, about his desire to take revenge on Sue. The brewing tensions and ominous events painted a picture of a sinister and unsettling chapter in Sue's life. Now that the detectives had figured out what went down between Sue, Brooks, and Nuzzo, they were determined to find out more about the two men. And in no time, the detectives made yet another scandalous discovery. In the summer of 1992, Northwest Airlines had been connected to a federal investigation. As a group of cunning baggage handlers ran a stolen credit card ring, an intriguing and illicit operation came to light, which had been going on right under the nose of their unsuspecting employer at Northwest Airlines. Their scheme revolved around intercepting shipments of fresh credit cards being transported on Northwest jets. These employees weren't just handling baggage, they were running a multimillion-dollar scam. Their operation was both bold and effective. They stole the credit cards, utilized them for their own gain, going on shopping sprees, until finally peddling them to eager buyers. The final tally of their gains from this fraud was staggering, reaching a jaw-dropping total of over $7 million, and not so surprisingly, the scandal was led by Joseph Nuzzo himself. As soon as Nuzzo joined the airlines again, he began stealing credit cards from mailbags. He was very careful though, making sure that nobody was watching when he did the awful deed. However, Nuzzo knew he couldn't go on forever without his employees finding out about his secret. And so he started to loop in his other crewmates along with him. Brooks became a part of it as well. By August 1992, credit card companies started asking questions, and Nuzzo and his gang could build a noose of suspicion tightening around their necks. Later that same month, Nuzzo was fired. Along with a few other baggage handlers, Nuzzo was subpoenaed by a grand jury, and the case was still being looked into. Detectives investigating Sue's murder were able to link her case to this scam, led by Nuzzo, because of two major reasons. The first being that Nuzzo believed Sue had ratted him out to the authorities. Nuzzo didn't shy away from expressing his anger towards Sue. Even though she claimed that she didn't have a clue about the fraud that had been going on, Nuzzo harassed her and warned her that if she testified against him in court, she would face severe consequences. However, the detectives' suspicions grew stronger when they learned that just 1 week after Nuzzo was fired because of the whole incident, Sue was found murdered. Even though Nuzzo denied having anything to do with Sue's murder, he was now a potential suspect in the case. But the detectives were unable to uncover any evidence that could strongly link Nuzzo to Sue's murder. With no new evidence or any potential leads, the investigation into Sue's homicide lost pace, and the case eventually went cold. A year passed, and there was still no signs of Sue's murderer being found. All her family had was many unanswered questions. There wasn't a day that went by when Marlene didn't think about the question, who could have wanted Sue dead? Marlene left Sue's room untouched just as she had left it. Marlene couldn't gather the strength to walk in as it would bring back a whirlwind of Sue's memories, eventually making her realize that there weren't going to be any more of those. She tried to do so before, but the pain was too much to bear. But later in 1993, when Christmas was just around the corner, Marlene finally walked into Sue's room for the first time since her murder. She wanted to get something that belonged to Sue and reminded everyone of her so she could put it by the Christmas tree for the holidays. Upon entering Sue's closet, Marlene's eyes fell upon her daughter's briefcase lying on the floor. She opened it, and amongst the many other things that were inside, she picked out Sue's diary. Unaware of the pain coming her way, she flipped through the diary. Her heart ached as she read the disturbing revelations Sue had penned across pages. In gut-wrenching detail, Sue had described the torture and harassment she had silently endured during her time at Northwest Airlines. These were painful incidents that Sue had never shared with her family. And as the diary bore witness to Sue's suffering, she continued to speak from beyond the grave. Within those pages, Sue had talked about the disturbing graffiti and quotes that her male co-workers had etched in the airport's men's rooms, and even the cargo holds of jets. All of those were directed at Sue, and were insulting, demeaning, and extremely malicious in nature. The extent of the cruelty and harassment detailed in Sue's diary left Marlene in complete shock. She was aware of Sue's struggles with her male colleagues who were resistant to the idea of having a female boss. But the diary entries revealed a much graver situation than she had ever imagined. The situation grew even more distressing when Sue discovered a disturbing illustration on her own locker. The sketch showed a coffin adorned with Sue's name on it. Sue had finally had enough. She refused to suffer in silence anymore and took a stance by filing numerous formal complaints with both Northwest Airlines management and her union, hoping that there would be a better work environment for herself and the other female employees. However, the response from management proved to be deeply disheartening. Instead of addressing the issue, they offered Sue some cold advice, urging her to let it go. They even recommended her to not show any signs of being bothered by the harassment, and instructed her to simply sit back and ignore it. But no good ever came from it. In the end, Sue always found herself alone and helpless, as anyone who would step in to defend her would face threats and abuse at the hands of their dominant co-workers. The harassment didn't end at the workplace. In her diary, Sue documented a series of distressing anonymous phone calls that she received during almost all the nights she had spent at home. She even recorded a couple of those haunting calls. In one particular unnerving instance, the caller taunted Sue with the words, "Get off our backs, Sue T, baby." When she ordered the caller to reveal their identity, the caller remained silent, adding another layer of fear and apprehension to her already troubled existence. Surprisingly, Sue's diary only covered her initial 8.5 months in her new position. However, it appeared that the discrimination against her still went on at Northwest Airlines. Even in the face of such mistreatment, her determination remained steady. She confided in friends and colleagues who stood by her side and gave her the boost to stand up against her tormentors. Sue was aware that if she resigned and walked away, it would only be a win for her male co-workers who had been harassing her. She was not going to let that happen, as it would make it even more difficult for other women to get a job here. Sue's plan was simple. She would continue to show up for work daily and diligently perform her job, making a statement that she wasn't going to give up. Amidst the shocking content, Marlene couldn't help but wonder if this relentless harassment might have played a sinister role in Sue's tragic murder. The diary was a chilling testament to what Sue had endured during her employment at the airport. And since it had shed new light on the possible motives behind the heinous crime, Marlene decided to let authorities in on this newfound information, hoping to bring justice to her daughter. The detectives arrived at Logan Airport and began questioning Northwest Airlines employees, who they suspected had been mentioned in Sue's diary. Deborah Mazikis, one of Sue's co-workers, said that some men in her crew resented women in a position of authority. Some came to terms with it while the others liked it. According to Deborah, Sue was always very conscientious about her job and always tried to make it a better place to work. Sue was certain that she could make a difference for the minorities and the women who worked there. Everything Marlene read in Sue's diary inched her closer towards believing that Sue was set up by her co-workers that night on September 13, 1992. She was sure that Sue had been lured to go to the restaurant by someone she most definitely knew. According to Marlene, Sue's co-workers thought that by harassing her, they could make her quit the job and get rid of her. But when that didn't work, they resorted to doing the most horrible thing. Although the new developments in Sue's case gave detectives a new direction, they eventually led to another dead end. In 1995, Sue's family filed a lawsuit against Northwest Airlines for allegations of harassment Sue had to endure during her tenure at the company. Subsequently, both the parties involved reached a settlement. According to the terms of the agreement of the settlement, Northwest Airlines handed a $75,000 payout to Sue's estate, along with a commitment to offer a $250,000 reward to anyone who would provide any information leading to an arrest and conviction in Sue's case. The settlement became recognized because of being one of the most substantial discrimination settlements ever awarded in the state of Massachusetts. Northwest Airlines denied being a part of any foul play in the matter of Sue's murder. That same year, Nuzzo faced conviction on multiple charges associated with the credit card scheme, and he was handed a 3-year prison sentence. Brooks, on the other hand, opted to cooperate with the police and subsequently pleaded guilty to theft and fraud charges linked to the scheme. He received a 3-year probation sentence. In the course of time, 10 more Northwest employees found themselves indicted and subject to varying sentences in connection with the case. Alongside some of Sue's other co-workers at Northwest, both Nuzzo and Brooks were still considered potential suspects in the homicide. Regrettably, the case went cold, leaving many questions unanswered. Although Sue's father Ron passed away in 2011 and Sue's brother Ronald passed away in 2007, Marlene still stands strong, fighting every day for her daughter. For many long years, Marlene Taraskiewicz remained committed to keeping her daughter in the public eye, persistently seeking answers. The identity of her daughter's caller still eludes her, a question that has ignited a glimmer of hope within her. She is inspired to keep working towards getting justice for her long-gone daughter. It brings closure to the families, she reflected, highlighting that she still doesn't have that much needed closure. With unwavering determination, she conveyed a clear message to the person responsible for her daughter's murder, warning them to remain vigilant at all times. They can't rest easy now since she will never give up, and one day, eventually there will be justice. In her last message, issued on Wednesday, September 13, 2023, Marlene Taraskiewicz extended a heartfelt plea to anyone who had information about Sue's case and asking them to come forward. Her quest for justice and closure for her daughter had endured many difficult years, and now she wouldn't rest until the culprit is behind bars. Marlene is in constant touch with the detectives working on Sue's case, and is hopeful that someday she will be able to look her daughter's killers in the eye in court. Marlene recalled that she had shared precious moments with Sue on her 50th birthday. Marlene laughed as she reminisced about the fun night out with her family. Marlene expressed her deep gratitude for the cherished memory. Despite the underlying sadness of the situation, she found solace in the fact that that memory was linked to such a significant day, making it all the more special. On Wednesday, September 13, 2023, the state police once again stated they believe that some people knew about Susan Charaskiewicz's murder, but haven't told the police. They already had some information regarding the case, but they needed more details to be sure. They wanted anyone with information to come forward and have asked the public for help in finding the person or people involved in Sue's murder. While they haven't found any new leads in the case, they were happy that Susan's story was talked about on a podcast called The Deck. This would help keep Sue's case in the talks. And if her killer was listening, it would remind them that justice wasn't far away. Thursday, September 14th, 2023, marked 31 years since 27-year-old Susan Charaskiewicz's body was found in the trunk of her car. The Massachusetts State Police made it clear they were still very committed to finding the person who hurt her. Even though a long time had passed, they were still determined to catch the person responsible. As Sue's mother awaits justice, the police are actively looking for Sue's killer. They do not want to leave any stones unturned and are pursuing traditional street-level investigative methods, coupled with advanced forensic techniques on the evidence they currently have. Additionally, they are reaching out to the public by creating playing cards that showcase homicide cases and missing persons. These cards are provided to state prison inmates, and the hope is that this might yield more information about the cases featured on the cards. In an old clip, Marlene urged the public to do their bit and help her out even if they had the slightest piece of information. If anyone has information regarding Susan Charaskiewicz's murder, they are encouraged to contact the state police. Do you think the person who called Sue just before she left to get sandwiches was the same person who had been making those anonymous threatening calls to Sue for many nights? Did he lure Sue towards him by offering to reveal his identity? Do you think that the guilt would someday get to Sue's killer, and they would eventually come forward? Let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. 26-year-old Zain Waliani resides in Lilburn, Georgia, but his passion for adventure has led him around the globe. For a long time, one of his dream excursions was to hike the 13,000-foot Aquitanango Mountain, which offers stunning views of the Volcan de Fuego, the volcano of fire located near Antigua, Guatemala. This hike is known for being among the best for seasoned hikers in all of Guatemala, providing breathtaking vistas of the area and the active volcano. Zain finally had the chance to visit Guatemala and realize his dream of hiking the mountain in May 2024. He traveled with his friend Josh, and the duo began their ascent on Tuesday, May 21st, after spending a few days in Guatemala. Zain called his father and left him a message telling him he was about to start the long hike. Zain started having trouble acclimating to the high elevation and began showing signs of altitude sickness, which slowed him down greatly. Josh would periodically have to stop to wait for him. By Zain's own later admission, he became frustrated and his ego got the best of him. He told Josh to go on without him, making a plan to meet up with him at the summit. Zain never arrived at their meeting spot. Josh waited for Zain at the summit but ultimately hiked back down. He waited for Zain for a total of about 9 hours, but Zain never came back down the mountain. Josh then contacted local search and rescue and the local police, as well as Zain's family. His family contacted the U.S. Embassy and began disseminating his picture online in hopes that someone had seen him. Soon, their efforts resulted in local police, numerous charities, local search and rescue groups, and numerous volunteers searching for Zain on the mountain and in the encompassing jungle. Helicopters and drones searched for him from the air. For days after he went missing, Zain found his way to local police on a farming road to ask for help. Because of the massive effort underway to find him, they immediately knew who he was. Zain had badly sprained his ankle as he tried to make his way up the steep, ashy summit, so it took him hours to limp up to the top of the mountain. His cell phone died 20 minutes before he reached it, where he would have had a signal. Finding no one at the summit, he began his way back down the mountain. He fell twice as he did so. One of those falls was 400 feet off of a cliff. Luckily, he went through very dense vegetation as he did so, which broke what otherwise would have most likely been a fatal fall. By Zain's own admission, the survival kits he and Josh brought were woefully inadequate, and they had split their supplies between them. Zain would say in an interview following his ordeal that every person on a hike should have an emergency kit, knife, and lighter with them. While Josh had most of the supplies and extra food, Zain had just a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, wet wipes, and toilet paper. Zain was aware that his survival was unlikely given his circumstances. However, his grandmother had passed away earlier in the year, and he knew his family could not face losing someone else just months later. He decided that instead of focusing on all the reasons why he would die in that jungle, he would think only of the things within his control that he could do to survive. Zain slept in caves and trees and drank rainwater as he made his way through the jungle, unsure if he was headed in the right direction. He left a trail of paper as he went in case someone came looking for him. He then came across a dog he had befriended at base camp before beginning his ill-fated hike. Zain would later describe the dog as an angel in disguise who aided in his survival. The dog accompanied Zain as he walked 14 hours a day, periodically going further ahead, but always coming back to Zain when he fell. Zain took advantage of the dog's superior hearing. Whenever the dog's ears perked up, Zain assumed he heard one of the numerous predators that lived in the jungle and went in the opposite direction. Zain and his canine companion eventually came across what Zain believed to be rainwater runoff, which led him to a farming road and to help. He was transported to receive medical treatment, but most of his injuries were minor cuts. He badly hurt his shoulder and bruised his kidney as a result of his 400-foot fall, but those were his most severe injuries. He was able to speak to his relieved family over the phone before traveling back home to them. In subsequent interviews, Zain has expressed gratitude for his survival, for his family's efforts, and for every person who took part in the search for him. Zain's next planned trip had been to Japan to go snowboarding, but it remains to be seen if he will be able to make that trip, as his parents took his passport from him as soon as he arrived home. When he made it back to the United States, he began looking for a foster home for the dog he credits with helping him survive. He is working to bring the dog from Guatemala to the US to live with him. 34-year-old Ian Snyder is a travel blogger and father of 3 from Ferndale, California. He is also an active hiker. At the beginning of December 2023, Ian was in Hawaii, and on December 4th, he set out on a hike. By his own later admission, he made numerous mistakes when it came to this hike. They began when he started planning it. He did not tell anyone where he was going to be hiking. He had mentioned to his father on the phone the day before that he would be taking a hike that day, but his father was not even aware that Ian was in Hawaii because he traveled so frequently. Ian also just used Google Maps to plan out the trails he would be taking. Since he had not used an official state source, he was unaware that he was planning to hike on a closed trail and should not be on it. Furthermore, he went on his hike alone in a challenging and unfamiliar location. That day, Ian would be hiking the Kolau Summit Trail, considered to be one of the most difficult trails on Oahu, if not in all of Hawaii. The trail became more steep and more treacherous as he went along, but Ian was able to use his extensive hiking experience to manage the conditions. Ian then made another error in judgment when he made a split-second decision to deviate from his planned route. At some point, Ian fell more than 1,000 feet off of the mountain. He does not have a clear memory of the actual fall. When he came to, he was not sure of what had happened to him or how long he had been unconscious. He was, of course, lucky to have survived such a long fall at all, but he was also fortunate in that the spot where he landed was near the base of a waterfall. He was able to drag himself over to a small stream that flowed from the waterfall so that he had access to water. He was also able to situate himself between 2 large rocks by the stream so that he was sheltered from the wind. Ian's family was unaware that anything was wrong until they had not heard from him for a few days. On December 6th, one of Ian's friends told him about a video he had posted on social media showing the area where he was before beginning his hike. This helped them determine that Ian was in Hawaii. They contacted officials there, and the following day, December 7th, the Honolulu Police Department contacted the Honolulu Fire Department requesting assistance in the missing persons case. The video Ian had posted to social media had been shown to members of the local hiking community. They were able to help identify the location shown in the video and began organizing searches for Ian. Honolulu police were able to use the last signal from Ian's cell phone to help narrow their search area. Rescue personnel from the fire department flew over the area and spotted Ian. They had been expecting the worst and were surprised to see Ian awake and aware enough to wave one arm to them as he heard them approach. He was given the nickname of the Miracle Man in the press because he survived such a serious fall as well as days alone in the wilderness. Ian was airlifted out and taken to Queens Medical Center in Honolulu for medical treatment. He broke bones in his face, arm, and hand and sustained numerous puncture wounds. One of his eyes was damaged and he was left with double vision in it. On December 12th, nearly a week after he was rescued, Ian was able to publicly thank everyone involved with finding him and bringing him to safety. After returning home to California, Ian filmed and recorded public service announcements for radio and television at the request of Hawaii's Department of Land and Natural Resources. In them, he detailed some of his mistakes and provided information about hiking safely. He ended his statement by saying, "Consider the risks first responders take. I'm alive because of them. Don't make the mistakes I did. You may not live to share your lessons." Christy Perry is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, and while she is now based out of Houston, Texas, she frequently travels throughout the United States. On November 8, 2023, 25-year-old Christy picked up a rental car in Midland, Texas, and arrived at Big Bend National Park near the Mexican border the following day. She had made a reservation for that night at the Chiso Basin campground. She never arrived for it. Christy's family reported her missing on November 15th after she failed to return home as scheduled. Christy's rental car was then found at the trailhead of the Lost Mine Trail. The trail is just under 5 miles long round trip and climbs through the woodlands of the Chisos Mountains. It is a very popular trail because it provides beautiful views of the surrounding area. The trail was closed to the public so that a massive search for Christie could begin. The park does not have cell service and Christie's phone could not be tracked. Park rangers and U.S. Border Patrol agents searched the Lost Mine Trail on foot, and a park pilot flew over the trail on November 15th, the day Christie was reported missing. The following day, search teams made up of National Park Service employees, U.S. Border Patrol agents, Texas game wardens, and members of the Los Diablos fire crew performed a more extensive search of the trail and the surrounding area. Multiple helicopters and planes searched for Christie from the air. Around 9:30 a.m. on November 17th, more than a week after she went missing, search teams located Christie, who was awake and talking despite being outdoors without food or supplies, often in rainy and foggy conditions, for 8 days. A Texas Department of Public Safety helicopter airlifted Christie to Odessa, Texas, where she received medical treatment. It had been very foggy during Christie's hike on November 9th, and she had inadvertently gone off the trail and gotten lost within the park. Through social media posts, she has expressed her gratitude for the efforts and kindness of all those who searched for her in the park and cared for her in the hospital. Despite this experience, she has since returned to exploring America's national parks. The story begins with Shannon Elizabeth Graves, born on November 4, 1988, as the cherished daughter of Christine Graves and Ronnie DePaul. In her family, she held a unique position as the older sibling, with a deep and unconditional love for her brother, AJ. Their relationship was more than just familial. It was a bond strengthened by affection and shared experiences. Among her friends, Shannon was lovingly referred to as Star, a nickname that reflected her vibrant spirit. She was always ready to go the extra mile to support her friends during difficult times. In addition to her human relationships, Shannon shared a strong connection with her puppy, spending countless hours together, finding joy and comfort in their companionship. From 2014 to 2016, she was in a relationship with John Scarata, with whom she even got engaged. John owned a roofing business but had a troubled past as a drug dealer. Their relationship ended while he was incarcerated, and while the specifics of their breakup remained private, those close to John noted that he still had lingering feelings for her. In 2016, Shannon achieved a significant milestone by obtaining her cosmetology license from Raphael School of Beauty in Boardman. Filled with enthusiasm, she looked forward to embarking on a new career in the beauty industry. During that year, she crossed paths with a man named Arturo Novoa, and their connection quickly evolved into a romantic relationship. They decided to share a home in Mahoning Avenue in Youngstown, Ohio. However, their relationship soon took a dark turn when Novoa became abusive, leading to their breakup in December 2016. Novoa moved out of their shared apartment, but just a week later, they reconciled, and he was back living in Shannon's. Things were starting to look good for Shannon. However, everything was about to change. 6 months later, on June 22, 2017, the Youngstown Police Department received a call from Shannon's half-sister, Debbie DePaul. Debbie reported Shannon missing, expressing her concern. While it was not uncommon for Shannon to go without contacting her family for extended periods, missing significant events like her birthday and Easter raised red flags for Debbie, prompting her to reach out to the authorities. Even when Shannon's father, Ronnie, contacted Novoa, he claimed that she had moved to Cleveland to be with another man. Furthermore, the family repeatedly attempted to contact Shannon on her phone but were unsuccessful. By that time, the police were aware that solving the case would be challenging due to the delayed report. Nevertheless, the investigations into the case began in earnest, with authorities putting their full effort into unraveling the mystery. It didn't take the police much time to do a background check and find out that John and Shannon's breakup occurred while he was in prison, causing him distress as per those acquainted with him and Shannon. Adding to the suspicions, John had been released shortly before Shannon was believed to have disappeared. Detective Mike Lambert from the Youngstown Police Department believed that John had both motive and opportunity to do something to Shannon. However, John informed the police that he hadn't seen Shannon since February 2017. He claimed she told him she was giving her relationship with Novoa another chance, but he also admitted to still having romantic feelings for her during their conversation. Due to this, the police couldn't shake their suspicions about John, a person with a criminal past and potential motives. However, lacking concrete evidence, their hands were tied, leaving them unable to take further action. Despite the suspicions from police, John, along with Debbie, was actively assisting the police in their investigation, and soon law enforcement made an intriguing discovery. This finding led them to identify their second potential suspect in the case. The police conducted a search of the vehicle hoping to find clues about Shannon's disappearance, but what they discovered would completely alter their initial perspective on the case. At this point, Arturo Novoa became the main focus of the investigation. But the question remained, was he really behind the disappearance, or was there more to the story? To find out, the police knew they had to dig deeper into the case, and they knew that the case was about to get much more twisted. The police made numerous attempts to contact Novoa, but he never responded or opened the door to his apartment. Faced with his silence, investigators turned to people who knew Shannon for information. They sought to uncover whether there were any suspicious circumstances surrounding Novoa and if there were issues in his relationship with Shannon, and they did get some responses that would pique their interest. 11 days after Shannon was reported missing on July 3, 2017, the police received a call from the first suspect and Shannon's ex-fiancé, John. However, that wasn't the end of it. He had more to reveal. Now 3 people were in focus: John Scarata, Arturo Novoa, and his girlfriend, Katrina Layton. Now all police needed to do was to find them and ask what was going on. As the search efforts persisted, John had significant new information to disclose to the police, and this time it was a major revelation. Suddenly, the focus shifted from 3 individuals to 4 suspects in the investigation. This time, Andrew Herman also made the list. Information was scattered in all directions, the puzzle pieces lying disjointed. Assembling them was proving to be a complicated challenge, but the investigators needed one crucial piece to unravel the case entirely. However, the case was just about to take the most horrific turn. And this moment came when the police received a chilling 911 call on July 29, 2017 at 5:05 p.m. The scene was horrifying, and Ken and Jill Eskenbaugh, the couple who discovered the remains of an unidentified woman in their freezer, were left in utter shock. When Dan Kuserais, the lead prosecutor with the Ohio Attorney General's office, spoke to the couple, a chilling tale unraveled. Jill told the police that she was planning to retrieve meat for dinner from a freezer belonging to a friend of her husband's. She explained that she was looking for ground beef to make meatballs when she was startled to find a padlock on her husband's friend's freezer. Using a screwdriver, she managed to open the lock, discovering stacks of black bags and a bucket inside emanating a horrible smell. Alarmed, she asked her husband to investigate further. Upon opening one of the bags, he was horrified to find what appeared to be a human foot. When they looked closely inside the bags, they found the dismembered body of a woman wrapped in garbage bags, with the head missing. Now the question arose: who did the freezer belong to and why did they have it? Now the answer to the question of whose freezer it was quite unpredictable. But before revealing the person, was it actually Shannon's remains? Upon examining the body parts, the police made a significant discovery. One of the feet bore a scorpion tattoo, just like Shannon. The evidence was unmistakable. It was indeed Shannon's body in the freezer. Nevertheless, the police required a definitive confirmation. The remains were sent to the coroner's office, but due to the absence of the victim's head, the cause of death could not be determined. Despite this, the authorities were able to confirm Shannon's identity through her fingerprints. However, the police were now faced with the daunting task of unraveling the mystery of how she ended up there and when it happened. During separate interrogations, the Aschenbachs maintained consistent accounts, leading investigators to rule them out as suspects. However, a new individual came into focus, a man named Anthony Gonzalez, reportedly the person responsible for delivering the freezer to the Aschenbachs' residence. Now, once again, another person emerged as a suspect in the unfolding investigation. While some aspects of the case were becoming clearer simultaneously, the emerging details were also making it increasingly complex to pinpoint the killer. Investigators initiated a search for information regarding the new suspect, Anthony Gonzalez. And soon, Anthony was in the interview room with the police. Intriguingly, it didn't take long for the police to discover something that would change the whole course of the case. Additionally, investigators learned that Novoa was now in a relationship with Katrina Layton, with whom he had moved in just 2 weeks after the last confirmed sighting of Shannon. What made the situation even more unsettling was that they had moved into none other than Shannon's own apartment. It was now time to have an extensive conversation with the two prime suspects, Arturo Novoa and Katrina Layton. At the same time, the officers had a few questions for another person of interest, Andrew Herman. The police managed to locate Andrew and his girlfriend, Michelle Eilenfeld, conducting an interview with them. However, the specific details of this interview were kept undisclosed for the time being. Rest assured, we will reveal the complete story behind this notorious crime soon enough. Now let's jump straight into the interview with Katrina Layton. At this point, it was becoming clear that the case was centered around a twisted love triangle. Now the police were determined to dig deeper into the relationships, aiming to uncover crucial clues from Katrina's statements that could provide vital insights into the case. Such was Katrina's obsession that made it her involvement in this horrifying act plausible. The police, considering this possibility, now sought to extract a confession from her. They began systematically presenting the evidence they had step by step. Simultaneously, while Katrina was being interviewed, the police had Novoa in another room ready to gather information from him. It was now time to confront him. However, Novoa was not going to give in so easily. In the meantime, the police worked to gather any available information about the two suspects, and they did find some crucial details that shed light on the characters of both Katrina and Novoa. Having learned this about Novoa, they also uncovered further information regarding Katrina. The police were quite sure by then that Katrina hated Shannon and had something to do with the murder too. However, she was yet to break down. But sooner or later, the police believed Katrina's resolve would crumble. Their attention was primarily on her, although they from time to time gave her a break and spoke with Novoa. They understood that extracting a confession was becoming increasingly complex, although Katrina's statements were gradually becoming inconsistent and unreliable. Finally, when she became certain that the police were aware of the freezer being in her apartment, she admitted to buying it. Her frustration was evident, and it wouldn't be long before she began mentioning things she shouldn't. And that's when the interview went upside down for her. Katrina was living in Shannon's house. She was driving Shannon's car, and she was looking after Shannon's dog. Yet she claimed to know nothing about Shannon's whereabouts. Such contradictions would easily raise suspicions for anyone. As the interview reached a temporary halt with no confessions in sight, the police intensified their evidence collection efforts. During this whole case, Shannon's ex-fiancé, John, emerged as a crucial informant. As mentioned earlier in the video, he had informed police about Novoa burning items in a fire pit, and later, a partially burned bracelet engraved with Shannon's name was discovered where the items had been burned. This revelation strongly suggested Novoa's attempt to destroy Shannon's belongings, possibly to eliminate evidence. To validate this claim, the police decided to approach a man named Steve, whose house served as the location for the bonfire. Investigators interviewed Steve, and he recounted that on March 1, 2017, Novoa had requested permission for a bonfire at his house, a request Steve agreed to. Novoa, along with Andrew Herman, brought Shannon's belongings to throw into the fire. Steve revealed that Novoa had told him about Shannon's supposed betrayal, which was the motivation behind burning her belongings. Police intensified their investigation and reached out to Michelle Eilenfeld, who was Herman's girlfriend. She revealed to police that both Novoa and Katrina had killed Shannon, and it was Herman who had dismembered her. According to Michelle, Katrina's jealousy over Shannon's relationship with Novoa had fueled the crime. It became evident that the entire group of friends had collaborated to conceal Shannon's murder. The police didn't waste much time, and with all the evidence in hand, on September 17, 2017, Novoa was arrested and charged with 1 count of aggravated murder, 1 count of murder, 24 counts of tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, and 6 counts of abuse of a corpse, along with 3 counts of possession of criminal tools, 3 counts of theft of WIC benefits, 1 count of grand theft auto, and 4 counts of marijuana trafficking. However, Novoa pleaded not guilty. However, on August 8, 2018, the police decided to confront Katrina Layton once more. They reached out to her, offering a deal that guaranteed leniency. No jail time and probation if she cooperated. Remarkably, the offer proved effective, prompting Katrina to come forward with information. Following this, on December 18, 2018, the police arrested Andrew Herman for tampering with evidence and abuse of a corpse. However, prosecutor Dan Kizares struck a deal with Herman in exchange for testimony about the murder. He then stated that together, they attempted to dissolve the remains using sulfuric acid. This story was consistent with the packages of sulfuric acid found in the car Novoa was initially driving. However, they lacked enough acid to dissolve more than her head, leading them to purchase a deep freezer to store the remaining remains. This account aligned with the details surrounding the freezer, fitting the pieces of the puzzle together at last. Now all that remained was to confine these monsters behind bars. Following Herman's confession, Novoa agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for the dismissal of the aggravated murder charge, he pleaded guilty to all other charges leveled against him. On June 24, 2019, he was sentenced to a total of 48 years to life in prison at the age of 34. Subsequently, 29-year-old Andrew Herman also pleaded guilty to the charges against him, including treating a corpse with cruelty, engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity, and drug trafficking. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison in 2019. On the other hand, despite the initial deal made by Katrina Layton with the prosecution, which promised her no jail time and probation, new prosecutors took over the case and proved that Katrina was still in communication with Novoa while he was in prison. As a result, her original deal was revoked, and she was ultimately sentenced to 18 years in prison starting from June 2020. Michelle Eilenfeld, Herman's girlfriend, was also charged with lying to a grand jury and intimidating a witness. She received a sentence of 2.5 years in prison. Upon release, she would spend 6 months in a halfway house and serve 5 years of probation. On September 30, 2021, Novoa filed an appeal arguing that his guilty plea should be deemed invalid because he was not informed that a judge could rule for the sentences of each count to be served consecutively. He further contended that the counts were not merged properly, leading to more convictions between them, which was not legally permissible. So on October 1, 2021, the Supreme Court partially sided with Novoa. They upheld his guilty plea but determined that the trial court had made an error in sentencing, stating that some counts were not merged properly. Consequently, Novoa's sentence was vacated and sent back to the state court for resentencing. In February 2022, Novoa was resentenced to 43 years to life in prison. The case was solved and closed, providing a sense of justice to Shannon's family and friends. Yet nothing could bring back their dear Shannon. All that remained were cherished memories, a bittersweet reminder of the life she once lived. So do you believe Shannon's murder was driven by jealousy? Or do you think there might have been other factors at play? And in your opinion, was the final verdict satisfactory? Mary Jane Croft was born on November 19, 1911, in Montana, West Virginia, as the fourth of her parents' 8 children. At 17, she became Mary Jane Van Gilder upon marrying her husband, James. Over the years, Mary Jane gave birth to 7 children, though only 5 survived infancy. Sadly, twins Alan and Alice were stillborn in 1935. The family resided on a farm along Prickett's Creek, just outside Fairmont, West Virginia. By 1943, the marriage between the Van Gilders seemed to be falling apart. Early that year, Mary Jane left the family home and moved into an apartment above the Fairmont Theater. There have been allegations of abuse from James towards Mary Jane, but verifying these claims is challenging due to the passage of time, making it difficult to ascertain the exact reasons for her departure. Mary Jane worked in Fairmont for about a year before relocating to Ohio, where she lived in both Plymouth and Willard during her time there. In Ohio, Mary Jane was employed at the Wilkins Army Air Force Depot in the town of Shelby, where she worked as a high lift and fork operator. She did not have a car to commute to work, but luckily was able to get rides from co-workers. Mary Jane remained in contact with her children for a time, although that contact was sporadic and gave them little information about why she was living apart from them, were about her life in Ohio. In addition to her letters, she would sometimes send them clothes. On multiple occasions, she also mailed them war bonds she had purchased at branches of the People's Bank around Shelby. These war bonds would be the subject of the last communication she had with her family. In January of 1945, she wrote home to West Virginia asking that all the war bonds be sent back to her. Her family did as she asked. They never heard from her again. Mary Jane filed for divorce from James in February of 1945. Her attorney withdrew this petition in April of 1946 after she failed to appear for court proceedings. James filed divorce papers of his own, and the divorce was granted even without Mary Jane being accounted for. He continued raising his children and later remarried and had additional children with his second wife. He passed away in 1985. Because Mary Jane lived away from her family and wrote to them sporadically, they did not report her missing in 1945. By 1949, however, report her missing in 1945. By 1949, however, it was clear that something was wrong. In addition, 1949 was both the year that Mary Jane's oldest child, her daughter Anna Mae, turned 18 and the year Mary Jane's brother, Lester, returned home after serving in the Navy during World War II. Lester went to the sheriff of Marion County, West Virginia, who then wrote to authorities in Ohio. Anna Mae also tried to get in contact with her mother's employer, but did not hear back from them until May of 1952. They informed her that her mother had left her job at the depot on March 8, 1945, citing added household duties as her reason for leaving her position. Anna Mae began writing to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in hopes of getting them to help with the search for her mother. She exchanged letters with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover well into the 1960s, despite his insistence that the FBI did not have the authority to investigate Mary Jane's disappearance and that Anna Mae would have to rely on the local authorities. In the following decades, Anna Mae would reach out to the Social Security Administration, the U.S. Treasury Department, and the Ohio State Highway Patrol, trying to find a lead in her mother's case. Decades later, the grandchildren Mary Jane never met would comb through obituaries looking to see if they could find record of her death. In 2004, they were able to get an article about Mary Jane's disappearance published in a newspaper in Plymouth, Ohio. Once DNA came into common use in law enforcement, multiple members of Mary Jane's family submitted samples of their DNA to various organizations in case they could be matched to a set of unidentified remains. Mindy Wilson, one of Mary Jane's granddaughters, reached out to Shelby Police again in October of 2018. The case was then formally reopened and assigned to Detective Adam Turner. Detective Turner grew up living above his family's funeral home, and frequently being around people who were processing grief left him with a strong sense of empathy. He understood that Mary Jane's family was hurting without resolution in her case despite the amount of time that had passed, and dedicated himself to solving it despite the challenges posed by the passage of time. Detective Turner used his own money to pay for trips related to the investigation and appeared on several podcasts on his own time trying to generate leads. A major avenue of investigation for him was researching unidentified sets of remains to see if any of them could belong to Mary Jane. Over the next few years, Jane does in multiple states were exhumed so that samples could be taken for DNA testing. None of these Jane does turned out to be Mary Jane. However, the effort did solve an unrelated disappearance. One of the Jane Does Detective Turner researched was known as the Preble County Jane Doe, whose remains were found in Eaton, Ohio near the Indiana state line in May of 1968. The remains were exhumed for testing in late 2019. Initial DNA tests showed that the remains could not belong to Mary Jane, but Detective Turner continued on in hopes of identifying the remains, even though they were not connected to his case. He began working with Moxie Forensic Investigations in order to use genetic genealogy to hopefully identify the remains. This effort took 3 years, in part due to pandemic-related delays, but it ultimately revealed that the remains were not those of a woman after all, but of a man named Albert Frost. His remains had mistakenly been identified as those of a woman because he had been very small and thin, and his remains had been badly decomposed and scattered over a large area when they were found. Albert had served in the military, but then turned to a life of crime, allegedly breaking into as many as 100 cars in the town of Hamilton. He moved around a lot and his family was not always in contact with him, so his disappearance in the 1960s was not necessarily a cause for immediate alarm. He was identified because his great-niece had her DNA profile uploaded to GEDmatch, but she had never even known that he existed until the identification was made. According to Albert's surviving nieces and nephews, the family had heard a rumor that Albert had been beaten to death outside of a bar in Eton, but the circumstances surrounding his death are still under investigation, with Detective Turner volunteering his time to help. The big break in the case came not from a Jane Doe, but from Mary Jane's complete military file from when she was a civilian employee at the Army Air Force Depot. Detective Turner was able to obtain the file and uploaded it online. Someone he describes as a civilian sleuth who had been following the case brought to his attention a name in the file, Percy J. Sebring. During her time at the depot, Mary Jane had been promoted to high lift fork operator. She had taken over this position from Percy, so he most likely trained her for her new responsibilities. Percy died in Kansas City, Missouri in 1969 after being hit by a train. A listing on findagrave.com showed that he was buried at New Forest Cemetery in Forest, Louisiana, and listed a woman named Mary J. Sebring, who had the same date of birth as Mary Jane Van Gilder, as his wife. Mary Sebring died in 1990 and her grave was in the same cemetery. The Sebrings had 2 sons. Both of them had passed away, but Detective Turner was able to get in contact with some of the couple's grandchildren, who provided photographs of and handwriting samples from their grandmother. Forensic analysis showed that the handwriting samples were consistent with known samples from Mary Jane Sebring's grandchildren also provided DNA samples, and when they were compared to samples from Mary Jane Van Gilder's known grandchildren and daughter, it confirmed that Mary Jane Sebring was in fact Mary Jane Van Gilder. While Mary Jane used the name Sebring in her new life and she and Percy lived as a married couple, there is no record of them ever being legally married. Mary Jane was also somehow able to get a new social security number for her life as Mary Jane Sebring. Mary Jane's oldest son with Percy was born in December of 1945, 9 months after she resigned from her job at the depot. It appears that once she realized she could be pregnant, she and Percy opted to start a life together immediately rather than wait for the legal proceedings for her to divorce James to be completed. Mary Jane lived most of her second life in Arkansas. This news was, of course, shocking to both of Mary Jane's families. The Van Gilder family obviously felt complex emotions over finally having answers, but also knowing that Mary Jane had departed from their lives willingly and never contacted them again. The Sebring family was shocked that she had such a big secret and was able to keep it for so long. They loved her dearly, and her grandchildren described her as the perfect grandmother, but she seemed to be a perfectly normal woman. She loved to garden and had a particular love for hydrangeas. She was a great cook and made meals for her family. No one in the Sebring family knew very much about Mary Jane's early life as she did not like to discuss it. When she was dying of colon cancer in 1990, she had told one of her granddaughters that there was something she couldn't tell her and that she could never find out. At the time, her granddaughter had assumed that she was speaking nonsense because she was very ill. In light of this new information about Mary Jane and her 2 lives, however, she now knows how significant this statement was. Mindy Wilson is one of Mary Jane's granddaughters on the Van Gilder side of her family. Mindy was present for the press conference in Ohio announcing the solving of her grandmother's case on February 12, 2024. Prior to coming to Ohio, she traveled from her home in South Carolina to Louisiana to lay flowers on the grave of the grandmother she never got the chance to meet and had spent so much time looking for. Speaking at the press conference, she expressed her gratitude for Detective Turner and his dedication to solving the case. She also tearfully said, "Our family finally has closure. The search started before I was born. My aunt never gave up hope and is so happy to know what happened to her. This gives me some kind of peace and brings me closer to a woman I never met." During the press conference, in addition to providing detailed information about his investigation, Detective Turner also reflected on what can be learned from Mary Jane's case, saying, "What it shows is that our decisions can reverberate through time and distance and affect generations of our immediate family and descendants, and that our choices in life need to be made in consideration of how it will affect those who love us." Mary Jane's absence left a hole in her children's and grandchildren's lives that was a continuous wound. Questions will always remain as to why she voluntarily vanished from their lives. But at last, the investigation into her disappearance can be and is officially closed. In 2001, 50-year-old Leslie Pryor resided in a two-story brick home on Drummond Avenue in Chevy Chase, Maryland, with her husband, Carl. Their daughter, Lauren, had spent much of her childhood in that house but was now 23 and no longer living at home. Lauren described Leslie as just as beautiful on the inside as on the outside, noting that she was not only a wonderful mother to her but also very maternal toward all of Lauren's friends while they were growing up. On May 2, 2001, Carl left for work around 7:30 in the morning. Leslie was also scheduled to work that day, with a start time of 10 a.m. However, she never arrived. When she didn't show up on time, her boss called both Lauren and Carl to inquire about her whereabouts. Carl met Leslie's boss at their home on Drummond Avenue around 11:35 a.m. As they opened the door, it quickly became evident that something was amiss. There was blood all over the foyer, a table had been knocked over, and a rug was out of place. Carl went inside to begin calling local hospitals, thinking Leslie had been taken to one. Leslie's boss called 911, and the dispatcher advised them to get out of the house. Police arrived on the scene at 11:47. When they searched the house, they discovered Leslie's body halfway inside the shower in the master bathroom. She was face down with her legs sticking out of the stall. Leslie's autopsy and the forensic examination of the house showed that Leslie had been killed in the foyer, not in the master bathroom. Bruising and hemorrhaging around her neck were consistent with manual strangulation, and bruises on her arms and torso indicated that she had been struck in those spots. She had 7 lacerations to her head with corresponding marks on her skull. These injuries appear to have been inflicted as her head was slammed to the sharp baseboard molding in the foyer. Her killer had attempted to clean the crime scene, and it appeared that he had carried her body up to the shower in order to wash away blood evidence. Simply by virtue of the fact that he was married to the victim, Carl Pryor was initially considered a suspect in Leslie's murder, although no evidence was ever found to tie him to the crime. Despite a large volume of evidence being collected at the scene and an extensive investigation, it would be more than 2 decades before an arrest was finally made in Leslie's case. In 2024, Leslie's daughter Lauren was 46 with a strong circle of friends and a good job. She missed her mother greatly and still had hope that the case would be solved and she would find some measure of closure. She finally received the phone call she'd been waiting 23 years for on June 18, 2024, when she was notified that a suspect had been taken into custody that day and was being charged with first-degree murder. However, any relief she felt at the news was quickly tempered by a feeling of betrayal when she was told who had allegedly killed her mother. It was someone she knew, Eugene Gligor, her high school boyfriend. As a teenager, Eugene had lived near the Pryors and attended Bethesda Chevy Chase High School with Lauren. They had many mutual friends and eventually fell in love. Eugene spent a lot of time in the Pryors' home, regularly eating meals with Lauren and her parents. He also went on vacations with them to different beaches up and down the East Coast. Eugene's parents were going through a contentious divorce, which Lauren knew he was having a difficult time coping with. She also knew that some of his relatives had bad tempers, but she never saw any concerning behavior from him despite his family's troubles. Leslie Pryor was fond of Eugene, but Carl Pryor would occasionally tell his daughter that he thought something was off with the young man. Lauren and Eugene dated for 5 years. They broke up after 2 years of their relationship being long distance because Lauren had gone away for college. The breakup was amicable and only occurred because they were both young and wanted some more freedom. Despite the important part Leslie had played during his adolescence, Eugene did not attend her funeral 3 years after his breakup with Lauren. Instead, he drove across the country to visit a friend in Portland, not telling the friend he was coming until he had already started the drive. He ran into Lauren in a bar a few months later. She told him that her mother had died, to which he responded, "I'm so sorry." Lauren and Eugene saw each other a few times over the following years at events with their mutual friends. They last saw each other in 2019 following a memorial service for one of those friends. They had a conversation, but Leslie's murder did not come up. While Lauren was sure Eugene could not have had anything to do with her mother's murder, her father was not as certain. He had mentioned Eugene as a possible suspect a few times over the years, but Lauren had always dismissed the idea. Carl Pryor passed away of septic shock in 2017, never learning that his suspicions about his daughter's ex-boyfriend were correct. The last time Lauren had been contacted about Eugene prior to his arrest had been concerning, but still had not changed her mind about him being a potential suspect in her mother's case. She had received a text message from Eugene's brother in 2021 in which he said that he was afraid Eugene was going to hurt him. She did not know what to do and, therefore, did not get involved. In general, friends and coworkers have shared Lauren Pryor's shock at Gidger being implicated in the murder. A former coworker told the Washington Post that he could not imagine Gidger hurting a fly. Friends have described him as warm, gregarious, and zen. At work, he was known for being introspective and concerned about the culture and community of his workplace. However, at least one person, a former coworker, noted that Gligor's kind and calm exterior masked a bad temper and a superiority complex that would be revealed if Gligor was ever challenged or questioned. The coworker told the Washington Post, "Some people are receptive and warm. He does that at first when he meets everybody, but then as a giant, condescending prick." Still, this coworker had not believed Gidger to be a physically violent person. While in recent years, Gidger has at least presented a more calm demeanor overall, he does have concerning behavior in his past. According to the Montgomery County Police Department, he had previously been arrested for weapons possession, driving under the influence, and theft. He is also listed as a suspect in thefts from residences and burglary in police incident reports. The dates of these offenses have not been released. None of these charges resulted in Gligor being required to submit a sample of his DNA. Gligor's first marriage ended in divorce in 2015. He was known to have struggled with alcohol abuse during this time. He appears to have gotten sober by 2018, by which time he was regularly talking about attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and recommending self-help books to coworkers. Gligor remarried, and in 2021, around the time Lauren Pryor received the concerning text message from his brother, his second wife filed for an order of protection against him. She alleged that he was displaying erratic and frightening behavior, punching walls and throwing objects. A Montgomery County District Court commissioner denied her petition, stating in a court document that there was no reasonable grounds to believe that abuse, as defined in the statute, occurred. The couple later divorced. By 2024, Gligor had begun dating someone new and was living a comfortable life in Washington, D.C., full of social and cultural events. On June 9th, he was in Dulles Airport to catch a flight to Europe. He opened a bottle of water, drank it, and threw it in the trash before getting on his flight. Unbeknownst to him, the bottle was collected by an investigator and tested for DNA. 9 days later, on June 18th, after he arrived home from his trip, Gligor was arrested by the U.S. Marshals Task Force in Washington, D.C. because the DNA from his water bottle was a match to DNA from the crime scene. DNA evidence was available in the case because of how hard Leslie Pryor had fought for her life. Unknown male DNA was found underneath her fingernails, which presumably was deposited there as she tried to fight off her killer. That DNA was a match to DNA extracted from blood found in 3 other locations throughout the crime scene: under a baseboard beneath a window in the dining room, on the kitchen doorway connected to the dining room, and on the interior side of the kitchen door. In 2022, investigators began using genetic genealogy to attempt to identify the contributor of the unknown DNA. The DNA profile matches to numerous individuals, and Gligor was one of matches to numerous individuals, and Gligor was one of the surnames that appeared in these results. When police searched the records in Leslie's case for this surname, they found a reference to Eugene Gligor. He was in the file because one of his previous neighbors had called in a tip, stating that they suspected he was involved in Leslie Pryor's murder 9 months after the crime was committed. This was a neighbor who had lived near the Gligors at the time of the murder, not far from the Pryor home. The neighbor had contacted the police when they had learned that Eugene was connected to Leslie's daughter, Lauren. Eugene and his mother had moved out of the neighborhood approximately 6 months after Leslie was killed, but prior to that, the home had regularly been visited by police due to noise complaints and underage drinking. At the time the tip was made, Glegor was not interviewed, nor was a DNA sample collected from him. This overlap between the genealogical search and the case file made investigators confident that Eugene Glegor could be a potential suspect, which is what led them to surreptitiously collecting his water bottle and getting a sample of his DNA, which did prove to be a match and led to his arrest. Lauren Pryor was present for Glegor's first court appearance, supported by two longtime friends she and Glegor shared. Prior to the court appearance, she told journalist Emily Davies that she wanted to be there because she wanted to see Glegor finally be in court and wished she could give him a piece of her mind. Glegor has waived his right to a bond hearing. He remains in custody without bond because prosecutors consider him to be a flight risk due to his frequent international travel. On December 3, 1998, a woman named Julie Jensen was found dead in her bed by her husband. Initially, the police deemed it a suicide, but subsequent events uncovered a different narrative. Julie was 40 years old at the time of her passing and had been married to her husband, Mark Jensen, since April 14, 1984. Together, they had two sons, David, who was 8, and Douglas, who was 3 in 1998. Julie was a stay-at-home mother who had previously studied nursing before starting a family. Originally from Kenosha, Wisconsin, she had 5 brothers, one of whom had died prior to her death. The family resided in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin. On the surface, Julie appeared to lead a happy and fulfilling life. She was married to a successful stockbroker, had recently received a promotion, and was the mother of 2 beautiful children. However, in the years leading up to her death, the relationship between Julie and Mark had begun to deteriorate. Very few people knew the true nature of Julie's marriage, and even fewer understood what kind of person Mark was behind closed doors. On the day Julie's body was discovered, a neighbor with whom she was close approached law enforcement with a letter. This letter had been handwritten by Julie and given to the neighbor 2 weeks before her death. The letter stated, quote, "I took this picture and I am writing this on Saturday, November 21st, 98 at 7 a.m. This list was in my husband's business daily planner, not meant for me to see. I don't know what it means, but if anything happens to me, he would be my first suspect. Our relationship has deteriorated to the polite superficial. I know he's never forgiven me for the brief affair I had with that creep 7 years ago. Mark lives for work and the kids. He's an avid surfer of the internet. Anyways, I do not smoke or drink. My mother was an alcoholic, so I limit my drinking to 1 or 2 a week. Mark wants me to drink more with him on the evenings. I don't. I would never take my life because of my kids. They are everything to me. I regularly take Tylenol and multivitamins, occasionally OTC stuff for colds, Stantac, or Imodium. I have 1 prescription for migraine tablets, which Mark uses more than I. I pray I'm wrong and nothing happens, but I am suspicious of Mark's behaviors and fear for my early demise. However, I will not leave David and Douglas. For number 14-1380, my life's greatest love, accomplishments, and wish. My 3 Ds, Daddy David Douglas. Experts later compared the letter from past samples of Julie's writing, and they can confirm that she did, in fact, write the letter. This letter was not the only time she had hinted at her husband being the cause if she was ever to be found dead. She had left 2 separate voicemails for Officer Ron Kosman. In the second of the voicemails, she said that she thought her husband was trying to kill her. At the time of the second voicemail, Kosman was away, but he did get back to her as soon as he returned. Julie later told him over the phone that she had given a letter to her neighbor and a roll of film of pictures of her husband's work planner. She ended up retrieving the film and giving it to the officer on this visit. She also said that if she was found dead, she did not commit suicide and that her husband, Mark, should be the first suspect. Later detectives would not find the evidence in the planner that connected to the photos. She also made similar statements to her neighbors and her son's teacher about fearing for her life and that her husband might try and kill her. The neighbor also said that she talked to Julie on December 2nd, that Julia talked about not feeling well. An autopsy was done, but it initially did not have a confirmed cause of death. Law enforcement ordered a second autopsy, and this one put the cause of death as ethylene glycol poisoning, the primary ingredient in antifreeze. The expert also noted that her body showed evidence that she might have been suffocated. The first toxicology report said that she had excessive amounts of ethylene glycol in her stomach, and the second one said it was less than a teaspoon. Despite the inconsistencies, a lethal dose of antifreeze would be about 2 ounces of liquid. 5 months after Julie's death in April 1999, Mark was questioned by detectives. Given the allegations made by Julie, it is unclear why questioning took this long. He was asked by detectives to walk through the last couple days before he found his wife. He said that he had regrets about not calling an ambulance for Julie when she had complained of having difficulties breathing. He said on December 3rd, he discovered Julie unable to get out of bed and having difficulty walking. He told law enforcement that Julie had talked to him about her desires to end her life. Law enforcement pressed him on why he didn't do anything to help his wife. He told them, quote, "I just watched her die." Detectives showed him photos of Julie's nose at the crime scene and noticed that it appeared to be bent. And they told Mark their theory that someone had used a pillow to suffocate Julie to death. Mark claimed that it wasn't what had happened and continued to say he didn't do anything to his wife. Detectives also discovered at the time of Julie's death, Mark was having an affair with a coworker. Immediately after Julie's funeral, Mark sold their house and moved. By November 1999, it was discovered that Mark and his mistress were living together. They later got engaged in February 2002, and they would go on to get married and have a child together. On March 19, 2002, Mark Jensen was arrested and charged with intentional homicide of the first degree. At this time, he did not make bail and remained in jail while he awaited further court proceedings. This would be the start of a lengthy legal battle. Between April-May of 2002, witnesses would testify at pretrial about the letter and conversations that they had with Julie about her fears of being killed by her husband. In June 2002, Mark pleaded not guilty. In September 2002, the bond would eventually be reduced for Mark, and he would make bail requiring him to make regular check-ins with authorities. Next, the prosecution and defense would fight about whether the letter and witness statements could be entered in as evidence. This started in June 2003 when George Schroeder, the judge assigned to the case, said the letter and statements could be entered into evidence. In May 2004, the defense asked the judge to reconsider his ruling, and in June, he would remove the letter from evidence but keep the witness statements. In September, the prosecution would appeal to allow the letter. The issue would be moved to the state Supreme Court in 2005. In January 2006, lawyers for both sides were allowed to give oral arguments to the court. By February 2007, the state Supreme Court ruled that the letter and statements were admissible if the judge believed that Mark was the reason Julie could not be there to be cross-examined under the forfeiture for wrongdoing, which is the exception to a defendant's Sixth Amendment right to confront the witness against him. There was a preliminary hearing, and in April 2007, the trial judge made the decision that the letter and statements were admissible for trial. On January 7, 2008, almost 10 years after the death of Julie Jensen, Mark Jensen's trial would start. The big question, was it murder or was it suicide? The prosecution would argue that Mark Jensen killed his wife so that he could be with his mistress, that he slowly poisoned her, and when that was not working fast enough, he suffocated her on December 3rd. The defense would argue that Julie had been depressed, and when she found out about the affair, she got so upset and angry she set up Mark and committed suicide, that Julie had used the letter and all of the conversations she had before her death to frame Mark for her murder. The neighbors and the son's teacher took the stand. They talked about how fearful Julie had been, and the letter was also introduced into evidence. And the man that Julie had mentioned in her letter that she'd had a brief affair with was also brought in to testify. He talked about the brief relationship that happened in 1991, and it had permanently affected Mark and Julie's marriage, and that Mark put illicit pictures from the affair around the Jensen home for years afterward. The prosecution suggested Mark may have done it as a way of torturing his wife. Evidence was also brought forward from the family computer showing internet searches for ethylene glycol poisoning as well as other ways to kill his wife. The defense argued that it was Julie who did this research so that she could frame her husband. 2 sets of medical professionals were brought in, one for the defense saying that it could be suicide, and the other for the prosecution saying that she was asphyxiated and poisoned. Julie's doctor also testified that she had been frantic before her death, and the defense brought in a psychiatrist who would later testify that she was likely depressed and committed suicide. A witness who was incarcerated with Mark while he was being held in custody also came forward and said that Mark had talked about how he had suffocated his wife. A co-worker of Mark would also testify that Mark was talking about killing his wife. The co-worker had not previously come forward as Mark had been his boss at the time. Mark's new wife was also called to testify. She was called to talk about conversations she had with Mark via email during the months leading up to Julie's death and about their relationship that followed, about Mark's obsession with knowing about past partners and how he could research them online. The prosecution would argue that Mark was quite good with computers. February 19, 2008, the jury started deliberating, and on the 21st, the jury convicted Mark Jensen for the murder of Julie Jensen. A week later, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2009, Mark and his second wife got a divorce. Mark's defense attorneys started working on appeals almost immediately after the trial. They would eventually get some success in 2013 when a judge overturned the conviction and said that Mark must be released within 90 days or a new trial set. The appeal highlighted that Mark's Sixth Amendment right had been violated during his trial and how the letter should never have been allowed to be brought into evidence and that Mark did not get a fair trial under the law. By 2015, the Seventh Court of Appeal would uphold the judge's reversal of the conviction, saying that Mark's rights had been violated. The law previously used to allow the letter in as evidence was for if the express intent was to keep a witness from testifying, not if they were the cause of them not being able to testify. At this point, the state made an announcement of its intent to retry Mark Jensen, but in 2017, the judge taking the state's arguments would reinstate his conviction. In 2021, Mark's conviction would be overturned for a second time for the same reasons as in 2015. A second trial would be ordered, and the courts were in agreement that Mark Jensen's rights had been violated over the admission of Julie's letter as evidence. At this time, he was unable to be released as he could not make the hefty bail. This trial started in January 2023, but the letter would not be allowed into evidence this time. Mark Jensen, now 63, could be seen using a hearing device during the trial. Some of the witnesses previously called had passed away since the last trial 15 years earlier. Their statements would be brought in through past trial videos if they did not involve the letter or the statements. So many years had gone by since Julie's death, and the evidence in the case could only get worse with time. The prosecutors and the defense argued similarly to the first trial. His son, David, testified, now 33 years old, and was asked to remember what happened the day of and the days before his mother had died. His now ex-wife also testified at the second trial. Friends and family of Julie also testified to her character and how much she was loved. One of her brothers, Paul Griffin, testified that he suspected Mark from the beginning. The trial concluded and the jury deliberations started on January 31st. By February 1st, 2023, the jury convicted Mark Jensen for the second time for his wife's murder in 1998. Mark listened to the verdict with little emotion and was immediately remanded into custody and escorted from the courtroom. A sentencing hearing has been set for mid-April of this year. Mark Jensen always maintained his innocence. His sons also believe in their father's innocence. Julie's brothers are glad for the outcome, and after all this time, she has justice. After 25 years, multiple appeals, reversals, 2 trials, and a fair trial, Mark Jensen got the same resulted conviction of first-degree murder. Jeanette Beaver was born in October 1919, along with her twin sister, Grace. Tragically, Grace passed away from diphtheria at a young age, which led Jeanette's parents to become even more protective of their surviving daughter. Due to her father's army career, Jeanette moved frequently during her childhood. After he retired from the military, the family established a permanent home outside Portsmouth, Rhode Island. Jeanette was known for her independence and adventurous spirit. She had a passion for the outdoors and excelled in both artistic and athletic pursuits. By 1961, she had become Jeanette Sullivan. After a brief marriage during World War II, she married her first husband's close friend, Dennis Sullivan, in 1945. However, she divorced Dennis shortly after the birth of their second child due to years of abuse. By 1961, Jeanette was a single mother supporting her two daughters, 15-year-old Denise and 4-year-old Jean, on her own in Connecticut. Though the family faced financial challenges, Jeanette was incredibly resourceful. She was a talented seamstress, which allowed her to earn an income while providing her daughters with most of their clothing. In the summer of 1961, Jeanette took Denise on a road trip out west, leaving Jean behind in Connecticut with her grandparents due to her tendency to get car sick. Denise was thrilled at the prospect of the trip when it was first mentioned and was eager to join, having finished the school year with good grades. Along with Jeanette and Denise on this trip was a man named Charles Boothroyd. Charles was a widower who had faced many tragedies in his life even before he lost his wife, Dorothy, in 1959. Dorothy and Charles were the parents of 5 children. In 1934, Dorothy had given birth to a set of twins, the couple's 3rd and 4th sons. The 2 boys, August and Axel, were both born with serious medical problems. August died just 2 days after his birth, and Axel only lived for a week. The couple's 5th child and only daughter Lillian was born 2 years later. Their oldest son, Charles, had served in the Navy in post-World War II Europe. Their second-born son, Albert, tried to follow in his older brother's footsteps, but was rejected from the Navy because of his terrible eyesight. He then tried to join the Army instead. Despite finding that he had 2,400 eyesight and was colorblind, the Army accepted him. Within a year of his enlistment, the Korean War began, and Albert was sent to Korea. He was one of 2,000 American soldiers captured by North Korean and Chinese forces on November 30th, 1950. Albert was declared missing in action, and propaganda reports coming out of China would later list him as a prisoner of war. The Boothroyd family spent years waiting for news of Albert while hearing reports of the terrible conditions in North Korean POW camps. In August of 1953, the Army notified them that Albert was dead. They would not learn the details of his death until February of 1954. Captain William Shadish was the camp physician at Hufong Camp, where he had been a POW along with Albert Boothroyd. He reported that he had witnessed Albert die of starvation, exposure, and dysentery on January 31st, 1951. Albert's remains were never recovered. Albert's death was devastating to his family and most likely contributed to his mother's declining health throughout the rest of the 1950s. Dorothy died in 1959, 3 days shy of her 50th birthday. Out of her 5 children, only her son, Charlie, and her daughter, Lillian, were alive to mourn her. Despite the fact that Charles Boothroyd was more than 10 years older than Jeanette Sullivan, they had begun seeing each other after meeting at church. Charles soon became a positive figure in Jeanette's daughters' lives, and his family accepted romance despite the age gap because they felt that he deserved something that made him happy. Charles would later tell Jeanette's daughter, Jean, that he and her mother had planned to get married once they arrived out west at the end of their road trip. They never got the chance to, though, because that trip was tragically cut short. Jeanette, Denise, and Charles left Connecticut in a Volkswagen Beetle on June 30th, 1961. They made stops in Iowa, Nebraska, and Colorado as they made their way across the country. On July 4th, the trio was in Dead Horse Point State Park in Moab, Utah, where they were able to enjoy the sunset. While they were there, they met a man who was friendly towards them and told them facts about local history. After 2 hours, the man left. When Jeanette, Denise, and Charles were later driving away from the park, they saw the man again, now on the side of the road with the hood of his car up. They pulled over to see if they could help him. Charles got out of the car and walked up to the man, who said he thought he was having generator trouble. Charles went back to his car to get a flashlight, and when he returned, the man pulled a rifle out of his car and pointed it at Charles. When Charles asked him if this was a robbery, the man replied that he guessed it was and asked for their money. Jeanette Sullivan was furious that the man who they had been so friendly with and they had stopped to help had pulled a gun. She got out of the car as Charles was about to hand over the wallet, which contained all of the money they had left for the remainder of the trip, approximately $250. She took the wallet, threw a few bills at the man, and began walking back to the car. The man screamed at her to stop, to which she coldly replied, "You've got your money now. What else do you want?" The man then shot Jeanette in the back of the head. He then turned the rifle on Charles and shot him in the face, just below his right eye. Charles fell to the ground and instinctively used his arms to cover his head. The man shot him a second time at very close range in almost the exact same spot. The man dragged Jeanette's body to the side of the road and began walking back to Charles. If he had tried to move him, he most likely would have realized that Charles was miraculously still alive and shot him again. Luckily, he was distracted by the Volkswagen as it began to move. Denise had jumped from the back of the car into the driver's seat. She was only 15, but Charles had given her some instruction on how cars worked, and he had left the motor running. So Denise did her best to use the car to escape. Charles regained consciousness just in time to see the man get back in his car and drive after the Volkswagen. He tried to stand, but his injuries were too severe and he fell back to the ground. Just a few minutes later, an oil rig foreman named Leonard Brown was driving down the road when another car raced past him, traveling in the opposite direction. A few 100 yards down the road, he passed a Volkswagen on the side of the road, but assumed that the other car he had just seen would have stopped to help if someone needed assistance. Then, less than a mile after that, he discovered Charles Boothroyd in the road, covered in blood. Leonard luckily had a radio telephone in his car for work, and he was able to radio his company's office to ask them to call for help. Leonard then got Jeanette, who was alive but unconscious, and Charles into his car in hopes of getting the medical help more quickly. On the way, he flagged down a police car on its way to the scene, and the officer gave him an escort as he drove more than 80 miles per hour to the Dr. I.W. Allen Hospital in Moab. Despite his speed, Jeanette was pronounced dead at the hospital. Charles survived despite his extensive injuries. Denise was nowhere to be found. Charles was able to tell police what had happened leading up to Denise's disappearance. He also gave them a description of the man and said that his name sounded like Oregon. Charles was also able to give them a partial plate number for his vehicle, which helped identify which county the car was registered in. The description of the man and the car were quickly spread amongst members of law enforcement, and roadblocks were soon in place in hopes of finding Jeanette's killer and hopefully rescuing Denise. It appeared she had not made it very far trying to drive the Volkswagen before her mother's killer forced it off the road. Police presumed that he had forced Denise into his car, potentially into the trunk. Despite a massive manhunt, aerial searches performed by both the Utah Highway Patrol and local volunteer private pilots, and bulletins being sent out to all law enforcement agencies within 500 miles of the crime scene, the killer, the car, and Denise Sullivan were not seen for days. By noon on July 5th, both Charles and Jeanette's families had been notified about what had happened. Charles's son, Charlie, contacted Jeanette's parents and assured them he would do everything he could to help find Denise. He and his uncle, Charles's brother, Ernest, drove them more than 20,300 miles from Connecticut to Utah, barely stopping on the long journey, unsure if Charles would still be alive when they got to him. Miraculously, he would survive his serious injuries. The first break in the case came in the form of a phone call that had been made 3 days before the crime. The state employment office contacted the sheriff's office about the call, which it had received on July 1st. It was from a woman asking if they had any record of her husband, who had traveled to Moab the previous week in hopes of finding work and had not contacted her since his departure. She had hoped he had been in contact with them, but he had not. The woman had provided her name, but the person who took the call had not written it down. So when they relayed this conversation to the sheriff's office, all they could remember was that the man's first name was Benny and the surname sounded like Oregon. This immediately connected the call to the manhunt, as Charles Boothroyd had described his assailant's surname in the same way. However, it was recognized for different reasons by a sheriff's deputy who overheard this report being made. One of his best friends was named Abel Aragon, who sometimes went by Benny. The deputy did not believe that Aragon was the killer they were looking for. He was one of the best people he knew. However, this meant that he was always willing to help people. The deputy feared that his friend was missing because he had stopped to help someone, as Charles, Jeanette, and Denise had done and had been killed. His car matching the description of the car law enforcement was searching for could have been the result of the killer stealing it from him and using it during his next crime. This theory would be proved incorrect on July 7th. Around 10:30 that evening, 2 FBI agents sent from Salt Lake City to help with the investigation were on their way to follow up on a tip. When they came across the car, half the state was looking for a 1955 Ford sedan with license plate number CJ6626. They pulled it over at an intersection in Crescent Junction. The driver stopped but rolled up his window and locked his door. After a brief exchange with one of the agents, in which the agent asked the driver if he were Abel Aragon and the driver questioned if the agent was really with the FBI, the driver reached for something to his right. The agent could not stop him from picking up a .22 caliber pistol and shooting himself in the head. This all occurred near a gas station in the Crescent Junction town store. One FBI agent called out to two young men who were working at the time and had come out when they had seen the flashing red lights, telling them to call an ambulance. The other agent called in what had happened on the two-way radio in their car. The owner of the store, who had been deputized by the sheriff, ran out with a tire iron to break open the passenger side window of the Ford. He had to reach past the unconscious body of the driver to grab the keys in the ignition. He tossed the keys to one of the FBI agents who used them to open the trunk of the car as quickly as he could, hoping to find Denise Sullivan confined there but alive. There was nothing in the trunk except for Winchester ammunition boxes storing mining and camping gear. There was no sign of Denise. The agents tried to revive the driver so that they could ask him about Denise, but with no luck. He was taken to the hospital but declared dead shortly after midnight, never regaining consciousness. The man was Abel Aragon. Two major mysteries remained. Where was Denise Sullivan? And what had driven Aragon to become a criminal? Aragon was a married father of 5 who lived in Price, Utah, where he was respected by his neighbors. He was very conscientious, and all of his children were very well behaved. He had no criminal history and, according to both his co-workers and the United States Navy, was a hero. Aragon had started working in Utah's coal mines as a teenager. In 1942, at the age of 16, he wanted to join the Marines to serve his country during World War II. He was too young to enlist, so he lied about his date of birth. He was actually born on July 6, 1926, but he listed his birthday as July 29, 1924 on his enlistment paperwork so that he appeared old enough to serve and was accepted. Aragon received the Navy Cross for his heroic behavior in Guam on July 22, 1944. He repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire over several hours during a mission, completing it despite being injured and losing 6 of the 8 other men who had been fighting with him. He was briefly hospitalized before returning to combat and went on to fight in the Battle of Iwo Jima. After the war ended, Aragon went back to the coal mines. He was working on July 19, 1957 when an accident took the lives of 3 miners. A 4th miner, Mike Milovich, was rescued by a group of miners. One of the rescuers, Harold Wilstead, later died as a result of being exposed to leaking gases and was the only rescuer named in published reports about the incident. However, according to Mike Milovich, Abel Aragon had been one of the men who brought him to safety. Aragon committing robbery, murder, attempted murder, and kidnapping all at once when he had no history of violence or criminal activity was completely shocking to his family and friends. While his crimes were out of character for him, Aragon was under serious stresses at the time, and there were indications that he may have been experiencing mental health struggles leading up to July 4, 1961. In the early 1960s, the coal industry in Utah was on the decline. Aragon was laid off briefly in 1960 but later brought back to work. When he was laid off again in early 1961, however, it appeared his coal mining career was really over. Aragon found some odd jobs and received some unemployment compensation from the state, but was not bringing home enough money to support his family. He began traveling to Moab in hopes of finding work in the uranium mines there. It was around this time that some people began questioning the state of Aragon's mental health. In June of 1961, he met a couple, Genevieve and Lauren Johnson, who owned a peach orchard next to their modest home in Moab. They allowed Aragon to camp out in the orchard while he was in the area looking for work. Genevieve would later say that he expressed frustration with the fact that he had made so many sacrifices to serve his country, but was now unable to find work to support his family. She believed that he had developed some kind of mental problems as the result of his military service. However, neither she nor her husband viewed him as dangerous. We will never know why July 4th, 1961 was the day Abel Aragon went from being an upstanding citizen to a violent criminal. While he had been unemployed and in financial trouble for months, several stressors were more immediate to the day of the attack on Jeanette, Charles, and Denise. His 15th wedding anniversary had been on June 15th, and he was unable to afford to celebrate it. He believed he had finally secured a job in a uranium mine on July 1st, but the offer fell through. His birthday was coming up on July 6th, and he had to face turning 35 and being unable to provide for his family. Instead of celebrating the July 4th with his family, he was 100 miles away in one of the most remote sections of Utah, desperately searching for work to support them. Furthermore, the patriotic holiday may have exacerbated the frustration he felt with the country for allowing a decorated veteran to be without a job. Pondering Aragon's seemingly abrupt decision to turn to crime when all of his legitimate efforts to make money failed is an interesting exercise, but his suicide left investigators with no means of determining his thought process. The more pressing issue they were left with in the wake of his death was, of course, what happened to Denise Sullivan. Authorities treated Denise's case as a kidnapping and operated under the assumption that she was alive and needed to be rescued. This was, of course, the correct view to take because if Denise were alive, she would be counting on their quick action in order to remain so. However, Charles Boothroyd, who had witnessed Abel Aragon's abrupt embrace of violence, was not as optimistic about the young woman's chances of survival. When asked about Denise by a reporter, he said that she couldn't possibly be alive. As devastating as the idea of Denise being dead was, so were many of the possible alternatives. Immediately after she went missing, investigators feared Denise may be injured but not receiving medical care, psychologically tormented by the man who killed her mother, or abandoned alone in the desert without food or water. Later, when he believed any hope of Denise being alive was truly gone, Charles would say that he hoped Denise at least met her death quickly and that she had not suffered. The search for Denise involved multiple law enforcement agencies and dozens of volunteers. Pilots searched from the air and members of the search team on boats dragged the nearby Colorado River. Despite their best efforts, they did not find Denise or her body. A few potential clues were uncovered, but whether or not any of them provide information about Denise's fate remains uncertain. On July 7th, a pair of women's sneakers was found neatly placed along the Colorado River because it appeared they had been placed there deliberately. Police thought perhaps Aragon had put them there to show that he had placed Denise's body in the river. Some reports state that these were, in fact, Denise's shoes. However, this appears to not be the case. The shoes were taken to the hospital where Charles was being treated, and he could not identify them as belonging to Denise. Later examination of the 8mm film Charles had shot throughout the trip confirmed that the shoes Denise had been wearing were red, not black, like the shoes found by the river. Witnesses would later report that they had seen Aragon in the area of Polar Mesa in the 2 days after the murders. A search of the area located the weapon Aragon had used to shoot Jeanette and Charles, the clothes he had been wearing, and a shovel. In 1976, Cliff Anderson, one of the volunteers who had searched for Denise, said in a documentary produced by a local high school that the discovery of the shovel led them to believe that Aragon had killed Denise and buried her body since he had disposed of the shovel with the incriminating evidence. It presumably was evidence of part of his crime. 2 sets of footprints were seen on Polar Mesa near an old airstrip. It appeared that one person was forcing another person, who had small feet, to follow them. However, photographs were not taken and plaster casts were not made of these prints before the high winds in the area blew them away, so it could not be determined whether or not they were connected to Denise and her disappearance. A vast area was searched for Denise or any proof of what became of her. However, she, in fact, may not have made it very far from the initial crime scene. In a 2022 article, journalist Jim Stiles detailed a scenario in which Aragon did not abduct Denise, and she instead remained close to where her mother had been killed. Markings on Aragon's vehicle, as well as the Volkswagen, indicate that when Denise tried to flee Aragon and the Volkswagen, he came up behind it and rammed it from behind with his car. When this did not get Denise to stop, he pulled up and slammed the passenger side of his car into the driver's side of the Volkswagen. Even this did not get Denise to stop initially. Culvert up ahead, and Denise had to stop, or else she would have driven into it. As she could not get out through the driver's side door, she would have had to climb over the gearshift and the passenger seat to exit from the passenger side door. It is important to note that whatever happened to Denise after she exited the car had to have happened very quickly. We know that Leonard Brown arrived at the scene just a few minutes later. We know Aragon would have realized someone was coming because he would have been able to hear the loud car at that distance and potentially see its headlights. Aragon would have realized that he needed to leave quickly. However, we also know that Aragon was not moving very quickly at the time. A witness who saw him just an hour before Jeanette, Charles, and Denise came upon him on the road reported that he had been limping and seemed to be in pain. He may have been unable to chase Denise, who was young, healthy, and full of adrenaline through the desert, given the limits of time and Aragon's mobility. If Aragon did kidnap Denise, it is most likely that he was only able to because she gave up her efforts to escape as soon as she was run off the road and got into Aragon's vehicle without trying to run away. If Denise had still been trying to run away, she would not have been able to run very far. She would have had to make her way down a sandstone incline, which ended in a cliff, which is difficult to perceive even in the light of day. She may not have noticed it at all in the darkness. If she fell off the edge of the canyon here, she would have fallen approximately 100 feet, which could have been fatal. If she had seen it and stopped, Aragon may have caught up with her. Rather than try to drag her back up to his car and force her into it, he may have shot her where she stood because he knew he did not have a lot of time. Her body could have gone over the edge as she fell. The location where the FBI later located Aragon potentially supports this theory. When they began following his car, he was coming from the area of the crime scene. He may not have known for sure if Denise had been dead or alive when he initially fled the scene and had gone back to it to look for her. While the initial crime scene was searched thoroughly, search efforts had mainly been focused on areas outside of it, operating under the assumption that Denise had been abducted and taken away from the scene. However, reports note that the area around the Volkswagen had been trampled soon after Denise was last seen, possibly due to the number of people who had come to help. However, this may have destroyed evidence indicating if Denise ran from the car and in which direction she had fled. The area where Denise or her body could have fallen was largely inaccessible and covered in juniper bushes and boulders that could have easily concealed Denise's body from view from a distance. Even if law enforcement had been able to search at the bottom of the ravine, the landscape could have very easily kept her body hidden from them. The possibility exists that Denise met her tragic end very quickly, which is perhaps more merciful than the possibility that she was abducted and terrified for potentially up to 2 days before she was killed. 1961 soon saw the death of another family member, William Beaver, Jeanette's father and Denise's grandfather, passed away just 3 months after Jeanette was killed and Denise went missing. His death occurred while the legal proceedings concerning custody of his other granddaughter, 4-year-old Jean, were still underway. William and his wife, Grace, had filed for custody of her, but so had her absent father as well as her aunt and uncle. Even after William's death, a judge ruled that being adopted by Grace would be what was best for Jean because of the close relationship they had for all of Jean's life. They knew Denise was almost certainly dead. Grace and Jean found themselves holding on to fantasies of Denise having amnesia after sustaining a head injury and living a happy life with a family who had taken her in to care for her. Even more than a decade later, as it became harder for Grace to maintain her house as she aged, she did not want to sell it in case Denise came there looking for her. It would be years before Grace and Jean could fully give up hope of Denise returning home. Any hopes Charles Boothroyd may have had of a second marriage and a fresh start in life seemed to have died with Jeanette. He never remarried. However, he remained active in the life of Jeanette's younger daughter, Jean. He was always there for Christmas and for her birthdays. Jean was married in 1974, but the marriage soon ended in divorce. Her grandmother, Grace, the only biological family member left in her life, passed away in 1979. When Jean remarried in 1981, she was not without family at the ceremony, however. Charles was there to serve as father of the bride and walk her down the aisle. Charles passed away in 1989. Jean has remained in contact with his granddaughters. Jean and her husband, Lawrence, celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 2021, and Jean is now both a mother and a grandmother. Nevertheless, She struggled for decades following the loss of her mother and sister. It took her own daughter telling her that she deserved happiness, for her to truly embrace all the good things in her life, even though Jeanette and Denise were not there to share in them with her. Jean does not have any hate in her heart for Abel Aragon despite what he did to her family. This is in large part due to the influence of her grandmother, Grace. Over the years, Jean would overhear her grandmother talking about that poor woman when discussing the case, referring to Aragon's widow, Eva. As Jean grew older and was better able to understand what had happened, Grace impressed upon her the importance of looking at all sides of the tragedy, not just what had happened to them. She raised Jean to consider what Aragon's family was feeling, even while she herself was suffering. As such, even though she bears the pain of the loss of her mother and sister, she has never borne the burden of hating the man who took them from her. Jean believes that Aragon may have been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder or some other mental health condition stemming from his time in the military. She said in 2021, Mr. Abel Aragon had never done anything horrible like this in his whole life. And something happened. Charles said when he came out of the car with a gun, his demeanor, his face was different. People don't just do this because they're hateful. They do it because there's something wrong, and we have to have compassion for their families too. Jeanette is buried in Rhode Island near her parents. A marker lies nearby for Denise, although no remains lie beneath it. For now, her body most likely remains hidden somewhere in the Utah desert, waiting to be found and laid to rest below that marker that waits for her back on the East Coast. In 2021, 37-year-old Lee Jingu was a father of 2 living in the Hunan province of China. This was not the location of his birth, however. Jingu could not remember the name of the village where he had been born, the names of his parents, or his own birth name because he had been the victim of child trafficking. When Jingu was just 4 years old, one of his neighbors lured him away from his home with the promise of taking him to see some cars. While Jingu did not remember the name of the village, he did remember that it was very remote, and cars were not a common sight, so he went with the neighbor. The neighbor took the little boy to a road behind a hill where 4 other men were waiting with bicycles. Jingu burst into tears. He was placed on one of the bikes and taken away from the village. He begged to go home, but his abductors refused to take him back. Within a few hours, the little boy realized that these were bad men and he would not be able to make it back home. Jingu remembers being given new clothes and taken onto a train by a couple in their 40s. They rode the train for a full day and night. He was eventually sold to a family in the Hunan province who raised him as their son and treated him well. Jingu did not remember the name of his village, but he remembered what it looked like. Over the following several years, whenever he felt homesick or sad, he would obsessively draw maps of the village. Before he was old enough to attend school, he would etch the map into the dirt with sticks, and when he was older, he would draw the map on pages of his notebooks at school. He spent years drawing the map every single day. It would be this map that would help reunite him with his biological family after more than 3 decades of kidnappings that occur in the country each year. The U.S. State Department estimates that approximately 20,000 children are abducted in China every year, with independent estimates being much higher. Abductions of boys are common for domestic adoption, a practice believed to be the result of the high value traditionally placed on having a son in China now that social media and DNA technology are more accessible. In recent years, there have been several high-profile cases of parents being reunited with their abducted children after decades of separation. It was seeing reports of these reunions that inspired Lee Jingu to search for his own family. He was further spurred into action by the realization that his mother and father would be getting older and could pass away before he found them. Since he could not remember details like his birth name or the name of his village, he could not simply return to the place of his birth and look for his family. After speaking with his adoptive family, he submitted his DNA to a database in hopes of finding his biological family. While it did not immediately identify his family specifically, it did give him a general idea of where he was most likely born. To help identify the exact village where he was from, volunteers Jingu had been consulting with suggested that he make a post on social media featuring the map he had drawn thousands of times as a child and could still draw from memory. He did make such a video featuring the map and his story, and shared it on the Chinese social media platform Douyin. The video was viewed tens of thousands of times within days of it being posted, and Jingwei received additional help from the Ministry of Public Security. The village in Jingwei's map was identified as one near Gaodong in the province of Yunnan, 1,000 miles away from where he lived with his adoptive family. There was a woman there looking for her missing son, who would be the same age as Jingwei and had gone missing around the time he believed his abduction occurred. Jingwei first spoke to this woman over the phone, and she asked him if he had a scar on his chin, which he did. A DNA test soon confirmed that this woman was, in fact, Jingwei's mother. They then spoke over a video chat, and Jingwei was shocked to see that they shared so many physical features, like their mouth and their teeth. He remembered his father's face well enough to know that they had similar foreheads and eyes. On January 1st, 2022, Jingwei was finally reunited with his family at a police station in Hunan. Overcome with emotion, he collapsed at his mother's feet when he first saw her and needed help from his brother and sister to stand and hug her. Both he and his mother were in tears, and she cried out, "I finally found my baby." Jingwei's father passed away before he was able to find his son. Jingwei planned to spend the upcoming Lunar New Year holiday, bringing his own children to visit his father's grave in Yunnan and be reunited with his extended family. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.